So this morning, we have the wonderful privilege of hearing from some desperately dependent people. People have been impacted by the ministries of DDCommunity, and in this coming hour, you'll be able to listen to a few of them share how they have been impacted by the ministries of DDC. Please pray and help us provide the message of desperate dependency to others by inviting these presenters to come to your church. And your faithful donations enable staff members to continue presenting conferences and developing new curriculums. So Kauri has been one of our spiritual children, I would say, and has grown very much. And we are very proud of her. So I give you Kauri Talent.
I am going to read this for the sake of giving due honor to the way that desperate dependency has impacted my life. So, I first met Kirk and Melanie in 2004 when I relocated to Tennessee after my first job out of college let employees know the day of that they would be closing their doors. Kirk and Melanie are to blame for a lot in my life. Mostly my successes and non-compromising. I wouldn't call myself brave, I'm not a risk taker, but I would have described myself as courageous and independent until 2009. My mother grew up in a family of 9 with an abusive alcoholic father and a codependent mother. My maternal grandmother didn't drive until she was 38 and never separated divorce from her abusive husband. My father grew up in a family of 10, and his mother died a month before my parents' wedding. Due to so many children being in the homes, as well as the loss of my paternal grandmother, my young adult parents were left to purchase their home without guidance, figure out raising children without guidance, and pursue spiritual development without guidance. You see, neither were raised in Christian homes, and both were first-generation Christians. My parents were courageous, independent, and raised me to be the same. They worked hard, did not receive government assistance, though I'm pretty sure that we could have received it, and rarely accepted help unless it was anonymous. My parents never told me that I couldn't do something. My dad never made me feel inferior because I was female. The model was to work hard for success. One of my dad's mantras was, if you do it right the first time, you won't have to do it a second time. I share all of this to say being courageous and independent was modeled to me. What further fostered these qualities in me was my brother being born with heart issues and later having behavioral issues, which led my parents to focus on his well-being. I was self-motivated with getting up for school, studying for school, giving myself a bedtime that allowed me 8 hours of sleep. I did this beginning in the 6th grade, doing morning devotions, etc. I was by no means a perfect child, but I didn't want to cause my parents stress, so I kept in negative emotions such as anger, sadness, anxiety, and continued to try my best at life. I was in Kirk and Melanie's singles group beginning in 2004. I learned much from them over the 6 years that I was under their teaching. But what most wrecked my life was when they began going through the desperate dependency material that they would later use for their book. In their book, Desperate Dependency, Finding Christ Relevant to Every Area of Life, Kirk and Melanie state, God disrupts our lives so he may redesign our souls. Just the concept of being desperately dependent was contrary to everything I had been taught. What I didn't realize until the desperate dependency study was that any person, place, thing, or idea that we are dependent on other than Christ sets us up for failure because no person, place, thing, or idea can carry my weight, meet my expectations, and give me an identity. It had been easy for me to identify women's dependency on men due to the legacy of my maternal grandmother, as well as my working on my master's in counseling and being aware of dependent personality disorder. but I had never thought of dependency on the self as being in direct opposition to God's will for my life. This was essentially the sin of Adam and Eve, right? Looking for an identity outside of the identity that came from them living in the face of God. In the book Desperate Dependency, Kirk and Melanie state, every temptation that threatens us is a temptation to live independently from God. As I was saying, the study of being desperately dependent on God caused what Kirk labels a crisis of truth. What made it super applicable to me was that my father died in the same season that our class was studying the material. My father represented stability and security in my life, and his absence challenged me to apply the desperately dependent concepts. I didn't apply them well. I placed expectations on my mom to provide stability and security, which she was not in the position to offer. I continued to be true to myself with being independent and courageous, and made poor decisions trying to appear like I had my act together when I was falling apart internally. It was when I took a job that was too much for me to handle on my own that I truly surrendered. The job was teaching and counseling at my undergrad college, and ironically, the first counseling group that I led was Desperate Dependency. Since that time, I've continued to struggle with willfulness, but am more aware of it and ask God for strength to surrender daily. The feeling of surrender is still not comfortable for me, but necessary for me to recognize that God holds all things together and not my efforts. Colossians 1:17 states, "In him, Christ, all things hold together." In the book Surrender to Love, David Benner writes, "The English word surrender carries the implication of putting one's full weight on someone or something. It involves letting go, a release of effort, tension, and fear, and it involves trust. One cannot let go of self-dependence and transfer dependence on someone else without trust. Floating is a good illustration of this because you cannot float until you let go. Floating is putting your full weight on the water and trusting that you will be supported. It is letting go of your natural instincts to fight against sinking. Only then do you discover that you are supported. What continues to be a challenge is that I'm not on autopilot with remembering that I'm desperately dependent on God. I often usurp his authority by planning out my own life, avoiding risks that I can't calculate, and looking for safety, security, and relationships. Here are some current areas where God is reminding me that I am desperately dependent on him. Community mental health. I work as a full-time counselor with a lower socioeconomic population. Most of our individuals have recently been released from jail, prison, or mental hospitals. It is normal for me to ask, how many times have you attempted suicide? I must be desperately dependent on the Lord to provide the strength, wisdom, and discernment for me to do this job. The second area, starting private practice. In addition to the above, I started private practice counseling a month ago. I had investigated private practice in the past, but there were too many risks and unknowns, so I always turned down the opportunity. God recently opened doors and provided others to encourage me to walk through those doors. I must be desperately dependent on him when doubts arise about my skill set, the pace of growing a practice, and how I would transition from my full-time job to private practice in the future. So I think it's ironic that I skipped over the first point of God helping me to be desperately dependent on him, which is probably my most vulnerable area. So maybe that was like a Freudian slip. But the first area is singleness. I often desire marriage, and as I have aged, there are less quality single men available. I must trust that God will provide in his timing if marriage is his will for my life. And if marriage is not his will for my life, I must trust that I can serve him best single. I must be desperately dependent on him when I have longings and desires that would seem to be best satisfied in marriage. So the fourth area, my life group leaders at church stepping down. I was in a life group at church for 4 years that learned together, laughed together, and served together. Most of us became involved in refugee work, and beautiful friendships formed because of serving alongside of each other. Recently, our life group leaders announced transitioning to a different service, and the group that had met needs of love and security split. I've been challenged to remain desperately dependent on the Lord when relationships that have provided security shift, continuing to look to Him who does not change. And the fifth area, the last area that I wrote about, but there are hundreds of areas daily that I have to practice being desperately dependent on the Lord. So the last area, refugee work. For almost 4 years, I've been involved with refugee work in our community. I've met several hundred refugees, but one I consider a son. He came to the U.S. due to war in his country with his 21-year-old brother as his guardian. They had lived in a refugee camp from the ages of 7 and 13 without the rest of their family until coming to the U.S. I have worked with this now young man on getting his green card, studying for his driver's test, and graduating from high school. I've wanted to give up on multiple occasions due to various challenges. I'm currently attempting to help him with future career plans. I must be desperately dependent on the Lord for this man's soul, this young man's soul, as well as his future. I'm constantly reminded that God cares far more for him than I do. Needless to say, the ministry of Kirk and Melanie and Desperately Dependent Community have greatly impacted my life in the kingdom work that God has called me to. Their willingness to walk in and speak truth regardless of whether or not others follow and respond has been astounding. I would greatly encourage you to get involved in their ministry by utilizing their counseling services, referring those involved in ministry for counseling, and supporting financially. Thank you.